The starship Horizon drifted through the outer edge of the Dalmar system, its sleek hull reflecting the faint glow of distant stars. Captain Davis Reed leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he watched the holographic display of nearby space. The hum of the ship's engines was a constant presence, soothing in its familiarity, but his mind was far from at ease. Reed had been a captain for nearly a decade, working for the Terran Trade Confederation. Transport runs, diplomatic missions, the occasional escort detail. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well. Yet here he was, skirting the edges of lawful space, hiding in a system that wasn't even charted on the official maps, and all for a reason he still wasn't sure he understood. "Captain, sensors are picking up movement near the asteroid belt," came the voice of his first officer, Renner, over the comm. Reed snapped out of his thoughts and straightened in his chair. What kind of movement? Hard to say. Could be just debris, but I'm getting some irregular energy signatures. They're faint, though. Could be cloaked ships. Reed clenched his jaw. Keep an eye on it. Let me know if anything changes. He cut the comm and stood up, pacing the length of the small command deck. His crew didn't ask many questions. They trusted him, and that was a rare commodity out here. But he knew they were wondering why they were lying low in a system that held no tactical or trade value. Why he'd refused every recent job offer from the Trade Confederation, even lucrative ones. He stopped at the viewport, staring out into the void. It had been 2 weeks since they had picked her up, a refugee fleeing from the most feared force in the galaxy, the Takara Dominion. The Takara were infamous slavers, known for their brutal conquests and the subjugation of entire worlds. They didn't care about borders or treaties. They cared about one thing: control. Any species or civilization unlucky enough to cross their path was given 2 options: submit or die. And now one of their prized assets was hidden in his ship. Reed closed his eyes, remembering the moment it all started. A routine salvage mission on the edges of known space had turned into something far more dangerous when they had found the escape pod. Floating, barely functional, with a single life sign inside. When they brought her aboard, Reed had been prepared for anything except what he found. She wasn't human. He knew that from the moment he saw her. Her skin was a pale violet, her eyes a deep, unsettling black, her features almost delicate. But it was her terror that had struck him most. He'd seen fear before: pirates, soldiers, desperate survivors, but this was different. She had been hunted. Her name was Kaela, and she was the last of her kind. The Takara had wiped out her entire species, enslaving any survivors they found. She had escaped, barely, and now the Takara were hunting her across the stars. He could have turned her in. The reward for delivering her to the Takara was astronomical. More than enough to retire on some luxury planet in the core worlds. But Reed wasn't that kind of man. There had been a time when he might have considered it before the war, before he'd seen what real suffering looked like. Now the idea of handing over someone so vulnerable to the Takara's cruelty made him sick. The sound of the door sliding open behind him pulled him from his thoughts. Captain Renner said, stepping onto the deck. "We've got a problem." Reed turned to face him, crossing his arms. "What kind of problem?" Renner hesitated, his eyes darting to the side before meeting Reed's gaze. "Kaela, she's in the engine room." Reed's brow furrowed. "Why?" "I don't know. She's doing something to the power core. The engineers can't get near her." Without another word, Reed strode past Renner and made his way to the engine room, his heart pounding. Kaela had been skittish, afraid of everyone but him. He didn't blame her. After everything she'd been through, trust wasn't something that came easily. But if she was tampering with the ship's core... The engine room was a maze of conduits and humming machinery, the heart of the Horizon. As Reed entered, he saw 2 of his engineers standing back, their faces tight with fear and confusion. And there, near the central power core, was Kaela. Her hands were pressed against the glowing energy matrix, her eyes closed, her entire body tense with concentration. "Kaela," Reed called out, his voice steady but firm. She didn't move. He approached slowly, motioning for the engineers to stay back. "Kaela, whatever you're doing, you need to stop. You're going to damage the core." Still, she didn't respond. Reed took a deep breath and stepped closer, his voice softer now. "Kaela, look at me." Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment Reed felt a strange pressure in his head, as if something was pushing against his thoughts. He stumbled back, blinking, and the sensation was gone. Kaela lowered her hands, her breathing ragged. The hum of the power core stabilized, and the lights in the room flickered back to normal. "What the hell just happened?" Renner asked from behind him. Reed ignored him, stepping closer to Kaela. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, her black eyes wide and filled with panic. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I had to. They're close." Reed frowned. "Who's close?" "The Takara," she said, her voice barely audible. "I can feel them." Reed's blood ran cold. The Takara had been chasing her for weeks, but they hadn't encountered any sign of them since leaving the last system. Now she was saying they were close? "How do you know?" Reed asked carefully. Kaela's gaze flicked to the power core, and then back to him. "My people. We had a connection to the energy around us. The Takara used it against us to track us. I can feel them when they're near. I had to boost the ship's core, mask our energy signature." Reed stared at her, his mind racing. He had no reason to doubt her. She'd been right about too many things already. But if the Takara were that close, they were in more danger than he'd realized. "Is it working?" he asked. Kaela hesitated. "For now." Reed ran a hand through his hair, glancing back at Renner. His first officer's expression was grim, but he didn't argue. He trusted Reed's judgment, even if it seemed reckless. "All right," Reed said finally. "We need to move. We can't stay here any longer." Renner nodded and turned to relay the orders to the crew. Reed watched him go, then looked back at Kaela. She was still trembling, her pale skin almost translucent in the dim light. "We'll keep you safe," Reed said quietly. "I promise." Kaela met his eyes, and for a moment he saw the depth of her fear and something else. A hope that she barely dared to believe in. "You can't," she whispered. "Not from them." Reed's jaw tightened. "Watch me." The horizon surged through space, its engines pushed to the limit as Reed guided the ship away from the Dalmar system. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to get as far from the Takara as possible. But space was vast and the Dominion's reach even vaster. There was no guarantee they'd be able to outrun them. Hours passed in tense silence. Reed stayed on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the sensor displays, watching for any sign of pursuit. Kaela remained below, her presence like a shadow in the back of his mind. He still wasn't sure what had happened in the engine room, but he had no doubt that she had saved them. For now. Captain Renner's voice broke through the quiet. "We've got something." Reed straightened, his heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" Renner pointed to the sensor readout. "Small vessel coming up fast. Takara signature." Reed cursed under his breath. It was only one ship, but that didn't mean much. Takara scout ships were fast, heavily armed, and equipped with tracking beacons that could summon an entire fleet in minutes. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Reed ordered, "and get the weapons online." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, but there was a tension in the air that couldn't be ignored. Everyone knew what they were up against. As the Takara ship closed the distance, Reed felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. He had been in more than a few fights in his time, but this was different. The stakes were higher. The Takara ship blinked onto the edge of the horizon's long-range sensors, a faint but unmistakable silhouette in the void. Reed gripped the armrest of his chair, his mind racing through their limited options. A lone Takara scout could mean two things: either it was an isolated hunter, easy to outrun, or a vanguard. If it was the latter, an entire Takara strike force could be seconds behind, waiting to pounce the moment the scout confirmed their position. Renner, status on the weapons, Reed called out. Plasma turrets online, shields holding at full strength, Renner replied. But we don't stand much of a chance in a direct fight, not with Takara tech. Best bet's to hit and run. Reed nodded. The Horizon wasn't a warship, it was a mid-sized freighter, upgraded for rough patches but never intended to face something like the Dominion. They'd need to outthink, not outgun, their enemy. Helm, get us on a vector away from that scout. I want the longest distance possible. Aye, Captain. The ship shuddered as the engines roared to life, shifting direction. Reed's eyes flicked to the view screen, where the scout was still barely visible but gaining. His stomach churned. They're faster than us, Renner muttered. If they get in range, they'll tag us with the tracker. Reed tapped his fingers against the armrest, thinking, is there anywhere we can hide? Someplace in system. There's nothing out here but debris fields and a few dead moons, Renner said, scanning the charted map of the system. Wait, there's a Class 7 gas giant about 2 clicks out. It could provide cover, but if we get too close, the ship's hull might not hold. Reed clenched his jaw. Class 7 gas giants were unstable, spewing corrosive gases that could tear through shielding if they lingered too long. It was a gamble, but it was better than facing the Takara head-on. Take us in, Reed ordered. Keep us on the edge of the giant's atmosphere. The helm officer hesitated only for a moment before adjusting their course. The Horizon banked hard, its engines groaning as the ship angled toward the gas giant. The Takara scout was closing fast now, a faint glow as its engines flared, speeding up to catch them. Reed's pulse quickened. They had minutes, maybe less, before it was in firing range. Boost power to rear shields, he said. And prepare to release the countermeasures. We're not going to make this easy for them. The gas giant loomed ahead, a massive swirling mass of purples, reds, and violent storms raging beneath its thick atmosphere. The Horizon skimmed along its outer edge, the ship's hull groaning from the gravitational pull. Hold steady, Reed murmured. Just a little longer. Scouts closing fast, Renner said. We've got about 30 seconds before they're in range. Reed didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the screen. The swirling gases of the giant were chaotic, but they offered the only chance of escape. If they could use the turbulence of the atmosphere to shake the scout, they might just have a chance. The Horizon dipped lower, the storms of the gas giant just brushing against its shields. The ship rocked violently but held. Reed's grip tightened. Now, he ordered. The Horizon banked sharply, diving into a denser part of the atmosphere. The ship shook violently, alarms blaring as warning lights flashed across the console. Reed ignored them, focusing on the scout ship, now entering the atmosphere behind them. The Takara were fast, but they weren't reckless. The scout ship pulled back slightly, not as willing to plunge into the chaotic storm as the Horizon. Reed smiled grimly. Deploy countermeasures. A series of metallic pods shot out from the rear of the ship, spiraling through the atmosphere in different directions. They were designed to release interference pulses, disrupting the tracking systems of enemy ships. For a moment, the scout hesitated, its systems scrambling to adjust. Did we lose them? Renner asked, his voice tense. Reed checked the sensors. The scout was still there, but it had fallen back, its course erratic. They had a window small, but enough. Not yet, Reed said. But we've bought ourselves some time. Plot a course for open space. The ship surged forward, cutting through the stormy atmosphere and back toward the safety of open space. The Takara scout didn't follow, hanging back at the edge of the gas giant, clearly unwilling to risk its hull any further. Reed let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Good work, Captain Renner said, his tone lighter. Looks like we shook them. Reed wasn't so sure. Keep an eye on long-range sensors. That scout might not be alone. As if to punctuate his words, the sensor console beeped loudly. Reed's heart sank. Multiple signatures, the helm officer reported, his voice grim. Takara warships, incoming fast. 4, no 5 of them. They'll be on us in less than 10 minutes. Reed's mind raced. The scout had done its job after all. It had called in reinforcements. And this time, there was no running. 5 Takara warships would tear the horizon apart in seconds. Renner turned to Reed, his face pale. Captain, we need a new plan. Fast. Reed clenched his fists. They were out of tricks, out of time. But as he stared at the approaching signatures on the display, something clicked in his mind. Kaela had said she could feel them, sense their energy. She had also interfered with the ship's power core, masking their signature. Could she do more than that? Without another word, Reed turned on his heel and headed for the engine room. Renner called after him, but he didn't stop. He had to see Kaela. The engine room was dim, the lights flickering slightly as the power core hummed. Kaela was there, sitting on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest. She looked up as Reed entered, her eyes wide with fear. "They're here, aren't they?" she asked quietly. Reed nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "We've got 5 warships closing in. We can't outrun them." Kaela's face paled. "I told you, you can't." "I know what you said," Reed interrupted, his voice urgent. "But I need to know something. Can you do it again? Can you mask our presence, hide us from them?" Kaela's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can do it for that long. There are too many of them. I'd need to draw more power, and the core might not." "We don't have a choice," Reed said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's either that or we all end up in Takara slave camps. If there's any chance you can stop them from finding us, we need to take it." Kaela hesitated for a moment, her gaze dropping to the floor. Then she stood, determination hardening her expression. "I'll try." Reed nodded, his stomach knotting with uncertainty. If she couldn't do it, they were out of options. But he had no other cards left to play. Kaela moved to the power core, placing her hands on its surface as she had before. The air in the room seemed to hum with energy, and Reed felt a faint pressure building in the back of his mind. He watched as Kaela's body tensed, her breathing deepening as she focused. The lights in the engine room flickered again, and the ship shuddered slightly as Kaela began to channel the energy from the core. Reed glanced at the power readouts. They were spiking dangerously high. "Careful," he said quietly. "Don't push it too far." Kaela didn't respond, her eyes closed in concentration. Reed watched as the energy in the room built higher and higher and higher, the hum in the air becoming almost deafening. His skin tingled, and he felt the same strange pressure in his mind as before, only stronger this time. Suddenly, the power levels began to stabilize. The ship's hum smoothed out, the flickering lights steadying. Kaela exhaled slowly, lowering her hands from the core. She swayed on her feet, and Reed caught her before she could collapse. "Is it working?" he asked softly, his voice tight with concern. Kaela nodded weakly, her breathing shallow. "They won't see us. Not for a while." Reed helped her to the floor, sitting beside her as the hum of the ship filled the silence. He didn't know how long they had, but for now they were safe. For now. Up on the bridge, the Takara warships closed in on the empty void where the horizon had been moments before. Their sensors scanned the space, finding nothing but the swirling gases of the nearby giant. And one by one they turned away, heading back into the vastness of space, unaware that their prey had slipped through their fingers. The bridge of the horizon was silent as the crew watched the Takara warships fade from the sensors. Reed let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For now they had escaped, but the reality of their situation remained grim. They were running on borrowed time. Renner turned to Reed, his face tight with concern. "We can't keep relying on that, Captain. She bought us time, but if those Takara ships circle back, or if Kaela can't sustain the mask again, Reed nodded, his thoughts already spinning through the possibilities. Kaela had given them a reprieve, but they couldn't stay hidden forever. They needed a plan, something more permanent. "We have to find a safe port," Reed said, running a hand through his hair. "Somewhere outside of Dominion influence. A place they can't track her." Renner gave him a grim look. "There aren't many places like that left, Captain. The Takara have their hands in most systems, even the ones that claim neutrality." "I know," Reed said, pacing. "But there are still places on the fringe, old colonies, black markets. Somewhere we can lay low, maybe even find someone who can help Kaela." Renner hesitated. "You mean smugglers?" Reed stopped and looked at him. "Or worse." The ship remained eerily quiet for the next few hours. Reed checked in on Kaela, who was resting in her small quarters, the strain of using her powers evident in the paleness of her skin and the exhaustion in her eyes. She looked fragile, but Reed knew there was a strength in her, a desperation to survive. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently, leaning against the doorframe. Kaela gave him a weak smile. "I'll be fine. I just need to rest. The Takara, when they're close, it's like they're pressing into my mind. I can't explain it. But it's harder to keep them out each time." Reed frowned. "Is there any way to block them for good? Some way to stop them from tracking you?" She shook her head. "No, not as long as I'm alive. The Takara hunt energy, they latch onto it. My people's energy is different. Stronger, maybe? That's why they enslaved us, why they won't stop." Reed felt a chill crawl up his spine. The Takara's obsession with Kaela's species was more than just conquest, it was something deeper, more predatory. But there was no turning back now. He had made his choice. "We'll find a way," Reed said, his voice firm. "I won't let them take you." Kaela met his gaze, her dark eyes filled with an emotion Reed couldn't quite place. Hope? Or was it resignation? Before he could ask, she looked away, pulling the thin blanket tighter around herself. "Get some rest," Reed said softly. "I'll let you know when we've found somewhere safe." As he left Kaela's quarters, the weight of the situation pressed down harder on his shoulders. He had defied one of the most ruthless forces in the galaxy, and now his crew was caught in the crosshairs. But they were survivors. They had to be. Back on the bridge, Reed scanned through star charts, looking for any system, any outpost where they could disappear. Renner stood at his side, silently offering his support. "There," Reed said after what felt like hours of searching. He pointed to a small, remote system on the edge of the galaxy, Velen's Refuge. "It's a forgotten colony world, barely even a blip on most maps. A trading post for smugglers, mercenaries, and outcasts. It's risky, but it's our best shot." Renner studied the readout, frowning. "That place has a reputation, Captain. No law, no order. We'll be walking into a nest of criminals. And if the Takara have informants there." "We don't have a choice," Reed cut in. "Kaela can't keep hiding us forever. We need supplies, we need information. And if anyone can point us in the direction of help, it'll be the kind of people who live in the shadows." Renner sighed but nodded. "You're the captain." Reed tapped the controls, setting the new course. The Horizon's engines hummed to life as it altered its trajectory, cutting through the dark expanse of space toward Velen's Refuge. Hours later, Velen's Refuge came into view. It was an ugly world, a battered planet orbiting a dying sun. Its atmosphere was thick with pollution, and the few spaceports on the surface were surrounded by sprawling, lawless cities. The perfect place to disappear, but also a place full of dangers Reed couldn't fully anticipate. As the horizon descended into the planet's atmosphere, Reed could see the tangled web of ships and stations dotting the surface, makeshift ports where smugglers and mercenaries conducted their business far from the eyes of any authority. They landed on a weathered docking platform, the creaking of metal under the ship's weight audible even from inside. Reed knew this was a gamble, but he had no better options. They were running low on supplies, and Kaela's ability to mask them was fading with every encounter. "We're down," Captain the helm officer reported. Reed nodded and turned to Renner. "Stay with the ship. Keep an eye on the sensors and the comms. If anything feels off, we're getting out of here." Renner gave a terse nod, and Reed made his way to the cargo bay. Kaela was already there, waiting for him, wrapped in a hooded cloak to hide her distinct appearance. She looked fragile but determined. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "No," Reed admitted. "But we need supplies and we need information. It's our best shot." Kaela nodded, pulling the hood tighter around her face. "I'll follow your lead." They stepped off the horizon and into the chaotic streets of Velen's refuge. The air was thick with smog and the scent of burning fuel. The streets were crowded with all manner of beings, humans, alien species Reed had never seen before, and everything in between. It was a melting pot of desperation and survival, where law didn't exist and loyalty was to the highest bidder. Reed kept a hand close to his blaster as they made their way through the streets. Eyes followed them everywhere, predatory, suspicious, curious. Kaela stayed close, her hood drawn low over her face. They passed vendors hawking dubious goods, mercenaries sizing them up, and shady traders dealing in everything from weapons to illegal tech. Finally, they arrived at a rundown cantina, its neon sign flickering. This was the kind of place where information could be bought for a price. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of spilled drinks and a murmur of conversation. Reed scanned the room, his eyes landing on a man sitting alone at a back table. He was older, grizzled, with the look of someone who had seen too much but managed to survive it all. If anyone could help them, it would be him. Reed approached cautiously, Kaela a step behind. The man glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he took in Reed's uniform, then shifting to Kaela. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, but he said nothing. "You look like a man who knows things," Reed said, taking a seat across from him. The man grunted, taking a sip from his drink. "Depends on what you're buying." "We're looking for someone," Reed said. "Someone who can help keep us hidden from the Takara." At the mention of the Takara, the man's expression darkened. He set his drink down slowly, his eyes hardening. "That's dangerous talk around here, friend." "We don't have much choice," Reed replied. "We're running from them. They're hunting her." The man's gaze flicked to Kaela again, lingering for a moment before he leaned back in his chair. "I've heard of her kind. The Takara have a special interest in them." Reed's hand twitched toward his blaster, but he kept his voice calm. "You know anyone who can help?" The man was silent for a long moment, then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "There's one place. An old research station abandoned after the last war. Deep in the nebula on the far edge of this sector. It's off the grid, no one goes there anymore. If you can make it there, you might be able to hide for a while." Reed frowned. Why would a research station be safe? The man gave a grim smile. "Because no one in their right mind would go there. It was an experimental facility. Rumors say the experiments were on weapons, biotech. Whatever they were doing, they left in a hurry, and no one's touched it since. It's crawling with security drones. And there's something else. Something people don't talk about." Reed leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "What do you mean?" The man shook his head. "All I know is that ships that go there don't come back. But if you're desperate enough, it's the kind of place the Takara wouldn't think to look." Reed exchanged a glance with Kaela. It sounded like a death trap, but if it was as abandoned and remote as the man claimed, it might be their only chance. "How do we get there?" Reed asked. The man scribbled coordinates on a scrap of paper and slid it across the table. "Follow those, and watch your back." Reed took the paper, folding it carefully. He had a bad feeling about this, but at the same time he knew they didn't have many options left. As they made their way back to the horizon, Kaela spoke softly. "Do you think it's safe?" Reed glanced down at the folded paper in his hand. No, but it's the best shot we've got. As the Horizon prepared to leave Velen's refuge, the unease settled in Reed's gut. They were heading for an abandoned research station in the middle of a nebula filled with old war scars and untold dangers. And if the Takara caught wind of them, they wouldn't be far behind. But if they were going to survive, they'd have to risk it all. With a deep breath, Reed gave the order. The ship lifted off, engines roaring, and disappeared into the dark reaches of space. They were heading into the unknown again. And the hunt wasn't over. The Horizon drifted silently through the murky depths of the nebula, its sensors struggling to pierce the dense clouds of gas and debris. The ship's exterior hummed with static, and the viewports were filled with swirling colors, greens, blues, and purples, all shimmering in the distant light of dying stars. It was a place of eerie beauty, but also danger. Nothing felt right here. The energy of the place felt off, as though the shadows themselves were watching. Reed sat in the captain's chair, tense. "How's the ship holding up?" he asked. "Shields are holding," Renner replied, his eyes glued to the sensor display. "But this nebula is rough. It's messing with our systems. We're flying blind out here." Reed frowned. The nebula was vast and uncharted, a graveyard for ships that had been lost to its twisting clouds and electromagnetic storms. If the abandoned research station was really out here, it made sense that no one had ever returned. The deeper they went, the more isolated he felt, as if the rest of the galaxy no longer existed. "Any sign of the Takara?" Reed asked. Renner shook his head. "Not yet. But if they followed us through Velen's refuge, they'll be close. I'd say we've got a small window." Reed's eyes flicked to Kaela, who stood near the viewport, her hood pulled low over her face. She hadn't spoken much since they left Velen's refuge, but he could tell the weight of the situation was pressing heavily on her. The Takara were relentless, and no matter how far they ran, they always seemed to find her. "How are you holding up?" Reed asked softly, moving to stand beside her. Kaela didn't turn her gaze from the nebula outside. "I can still feel them. Far away, but they're there. It's like a pull, tugging at the edge of my mind. I can't block it for much longer, not with the nebula's interference. The Takara have ways of tracking energy. They're patient." Reed clenched his jaw. He hated feeling helpless, hated that all they could do was wait for the inevitable. He had promised Kaela he would protect her, but with each passing hour that promise seemed harder to keep. "We'll find that station," Reed said, his voice firm. "And once we're inside, we'll figure out our next move. There has to be something there, something that can help." Kaela looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "You can't keep running forever, Captain. Not from them." "We don't have to run forever," Reed replied. "Just long enough to turn the tables." Hours passed as the Horizon navigated deeper into the nebula, its sensors straining to pick up any trace of the research station. Reed had begun to wonder if they had been sent on a fool's errand, chasing rumors and ghost stories. But then, just as hope started to fade, the ship's sensors pinged. "I've got something," Renner said, leaning forward over his console. "Faint energy readings about 100 clicks ahead. It's weak, but it's there." Reed felt a surge of adrenaline. "Is it the station?" "It has to be," Renner replied. "There's nothing else out here that could give off those readings." Reed rose from his chair. "Bring us in, slow and steady. I don't want to trigger any security systems that might still be active." As the Horizon approached the coordinates, the outline of the station emerged from the swirling gases of the nebula. It was massive, far larger than Reed had imagined. Dark spires and twisted metal jutted out from a central structure, its surface pockmarked with the scars of ancient battles. The entire station was surrounded by an aura of decay, as though it had been left to rot for centuries. "Looks like the stories were true," Renner muttered, his voice filled with awe. "That thing's been abandoned for a long time." Reed nodded. "Set us down on one of the landing platforms." and be ready for anything. The horizon moved in slowly, the ship's thrusters firing in short bursts to guide it onto the decrepit platform. The moment they touched down, the ship groaned as if it could feel the weight of the place pressing against it. Reed unbuckled his harness and stood. "Renner, you stay here and monitor comms. If the Takara show up, I want to know the second they come into range." Renner gave a tight nod. "Understood. You be careful in there, Captain." Reed strapped on his blaster and motioned for Kaela to follow. They descended the cargo ramp into the cold, stale air of the station. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of old machinery, barely functional after years of neglect. Inside, the corridors were dark and narrow, the walls covered in dust and corrosion. The further they went, the more eerie the station became. Broken doors hung ajar, flickering lights cast long shadows, and strange noises echoed in the distance, as if something were moving in the bowels of the facility. "What exactly was this place?" Kaela asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "An experimental research facility," Reed answered, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "Biotech, weapons, probably things no one wanted the public to know about. That's why it's off the grid. Whatever they were working on, it wasn't safe." They moved deeper into the station, passing rooms filled with long abandoned equipment and shattered consoles. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Reed's breath misted in the air, and a sense of unease crept over him. Something about this place wasn't right. After what felt like hours, they reached a central chamber, its large doors sealed shut. Reed approached the control panel, his fingers brushing over the cracked screen. "This looks like the main lab. If there's anything useful here, it'll be inside." Kaela stood back, her eyes darting around nervously. "Are you sure we should go in?" Reed paused, glancing at her. He wasn't sure of anything anymore, but they were out of options. "We have to." The panel flickered to life, and with a low hiss, the doors began to slide open. Cold air rushed out from the chamber beyond, and Reed felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Something was waiting inside. As the doors fully opened, Reed stepped into the large, dimly lit room. The lab was massive, its walls lined with containment units, many of them shattered or malfunctioning. Strange devices littered the floor, and in the center of the room stood a large, circular platform surrounded by consoles. The faint glow of power still ran through the room, but it was weak, as if the station was barely clinging to life. "What is this place?" Kaela whispered, her voice trembling. Reed approached the platform, his boots echoing in the silence. "Some kind of experimental testing site. Maybe they were developing new weapons or something worse." As he scanned the room, something caught his eye, a small, flickering terminal near the edge of the platform. It was still operational. He moved toward it, wiping away the dust and debris from the screen. "What are you doing?" Kaela asked, stepping closer. Reed hesitated for a moment, then began tapping at the screen. It was slow, the system barely functional, but after a few moments the terminal began to display fragmented data. The text was garbled, but Reed could make out a few words: project, biosynthesis, neural enhancement. Kaela's eyes widened. This wasn't just a weapons lab. They were experimenting on living beings. Reed's stomach turned. He had heard rumors of facilities like this, places where the lines between science and morality blurred, where researchers pushed the boundaries of what was possible without regard for the consequences. Before he could respond, a low growl echoed through the room, sending a chill down his spine. Kaela froze, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" Reed's hand went to his blaster. "Yeah." They both stood perfectly still, listening. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something moving in the shadows at the far end of the lab. Something large. Reed's pulse quickened. They weren't alone. "Stay behind me," Reed whispered, raising his blaster as he scanned the dark corners of the room. The growling grew closer. accompanied by the sound of metal scraping against the floor. Then, from the shadows, it emerged a hulking creature, its body twisted and malformed, a grotesque blend of organic and mechanical parts. Its eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and its massive claws clinked against the metal floor as it advanced. Reed's heart pounded in his chest. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't natural. It had been created in this lab, a byproduct of the experiments that had once taken place here. "Run," Reed whispered. Kaela didn't need to be told twice. She bolted for the door, Reed right behind her, as the creature roared and charged. They barely made it through the doorway before Reed slammed his hand against the control panel, sealing the door behind them. The creature's snarls echoed through the walls as it pounded against the sealed door. Reed and Kaela raced back through the station, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. They didn't stop until they reached the landing platform where the Horizon waited. Renner was already at the airlock, his eyes wide with alarm as they sprinted toward him. What the hell happened? Trouble, Reed gasped, panting as they ran up the cargo ramp. Big trouble. Get us out of here. Now. Renner didn't need to be told twice. He raced to the helm, and within moments the Horizon lifted off the platform, its engines roaring to life. As the ship ascended, Reed glanced back at the station, now a distant shadow beneath them. Whatever had been lurking in that lab, it was something that should have remained forgotten. "Are we safe?" Kaela asked, her voice shaking. "For now," Reed replied, slumping back into his seat. But he knew better. They had escaped the creature, but the Takara were still out there, and time was running out. Whatever answers they were searching for in that station, they hadn't found them. And now the hunt would begin again. As the Horizon punched through the last wisps of the nebula, the tension in the ship felt palpable. The research station had been a dead end, a nightmare of failed experiments and twisted monsters, but no real solutions to escape the Takara. Reed's mind churned with the weight of it all. The creature they had encountered was a symptom of something darker, an echo of the station's forgotten purpose. It reminded him that the galaxy was full of horrors beyond even the Takara's cruelty. But there was no time to dwell on it. The Takara were still out there hunting them, and Kaela's strength was waning. Each time she masked their presence, it seemed to take more out of her, and Reed wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. Kaela sat across from him in the ship's dimly lit mess hall, sipping a cup of hot liquid to regain her strength. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken with exhaustion. Reed hadn't realized just how fragile she had become. "I'm sorry," she said softly, setting the cup down with trembling hands. "For what?" Reed asked, leaning back in his chair. "For dragging you and your crew into this," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt." Reed shook his head. "You didn't drag us into anything, Kaela. I made my choice the moment I decided to help you. And I'd make the same choice again." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt. "I don't understand why you're risking everything for me. You don't even know me." Reed sighed, rubbing his hands over his tired eyes. "I know enough. I've seen what the Takara do. I've seen them break people, strip them of their freedom, their dignity. I couldn't just stand by and let that happen to you. No one deserves that." Kaela looked away, silent for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "My people. We were proud once. We were explorers like your kind. We wanted to understand the universe, to connect with others. But when the Takara came, they saw us as nothing more than a resource, something to be consumed." She paused, her voice trembling with emotion. "They took everything." Reed felt a surge of anger, not at Kaela, but at the cruelty of it all. The Takara had enslaved countless species across the galaxy, but hearing Kaela's story made it personal. They weren't just slavers, they were destroyers of entire cultures, entire ways of life. "We're going to find a way out of this," Reed said firmly. "There has to be somewhere they can't reach." Before Kaela could respond, the ship's alarm blared. Reed was on his feet in an instant, racing toward the bridge with Kaela right behind him. Renner was already at his station, his face tight with tension, as he scanned the sensor readouts. "What does it read?" demanded. Renner's jaw clenched. Takara ships. 3 of them, closing fast. They must have picked up our trail again after we left the nebula. Reed cursed under his breath. There was no time to think, no time to run. They were out of options. "Raise shields, prepare for evasive maneuvers," Reed ordered, "and get the weapons online." The crew scrambled into action as the horizon shook under the first volley of Takara fire. Reed gripped the armrests of his chair, his mind racing. They couldn't take on 3 Takara warships, he knew that. But if they didn't fight, they'd be captured or worse. "We can't outfight them," Renner said, his voice tight with urgency. "They'll rip us apart in seconds." "I know," Reed muttered, his mind searching for a way out. Kaela stood by the viewport, her face pale as she watched the distant glow of the Takara ships growing closer. Reed glanced at her, an idea forming in his mind, desperate, but it might be their only shot. "Kaela," he said, standing and moving toward her. "Can you mask us again?" She shook her head, her body trembling from exhaustion. "I don't have the strength left, not against ships this close. They're too strong." Reed's chest tightened. "What if you didn't have to block them? What if you amplified their signal instead, made it so strong that it throws off their sensors, makes them think we're everywhere at once?" Kaela's eyes widened. "I don't know if I can do that. It could overload their systems or ours. And I might not survive it." Reed felt a pang of guilt. He hated asking her to put herself in danger again, but there was no other way. "I wouldn't ask you if there was another option. But if we don't try, they'll catch us." Kaela hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her face set with grim determination. "I'll try." Reed led her to the engineering bay, where she once again placed her hands on the ship's power core. The air in the room seemed to hum with energy, and Reed felt that strange pressure building in his mind again, even stronger than before. The lights flickered, and the ship groaned as Kaela tapped into the core's energy, pushing herself beyond her limits. On the bridge, the crew watched in tense silence as the Takara ships closed in, their weapons ready to fire. "Kaela," Reed whispered under his breath. "Come on." Suddenly, the sensor displays flickered, and the image of the 3 Takara ships distorted. They seemed to multiply, their positions shifting and blurring as Kaela's energy pulsed through the ship's systems. The Takara warships hesitated, their sensors thrown into chaos as they tried to lock onto the horizon. "It's working," Renner breathed, his eyes wide. "They can't find us?" Reed felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly tempered by fear. Kaela's breathing had become labored and her skin was pale, almost translucent. She was pouring everything she had into the effort, and it was taking a toll. "Hold on, Kaela," Reed whispered, watching the Takara ships on the display. "Just a little longer." But as the seconds ticked by, Reed knew that Kaela couldn't sustain this for much longer. The strain was too much. "Renner, get us out of here," Reed ordered, his voice tight with urgency. "Now." The horizon surged forward, slipping past the confused Takara ships as they struggled to recalibrate their systems. The nebula loomed ahead, offering the only cover they had. It was a gamble, but it was their only chance. The ship rocketed back into the swirling clouds of the nebula, disappearing into the chaotic storm of energy and gas. The Takara ships hesitated for a moment, their sensors still scrambled, before they finally gave up the chase, turning away and vanishing into the stars. Reed let out a long breath, his body sagging with relief. "We did it," Renner said, his voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it." Reed smiled faintly, but his relief was short-lived as he turned to Kaela. She had collapsed against the power core, her body limp. He rushed to her side, gently lifting her into his arms. "Kaela," he whispered, his voice filled with concern. "Kaela, stay with me. Her eyes fluttered open, her breathing shallow. Did it work? Reed nodded, his throat tight. Yeah, you saved us. Kaela managed a weak smile before her eyes closed again. Reed carried her to the med bay, his heart pounding in his chest. She had saved them again, but at what cost? Hours passed, and the crew of the Horizon was safe once more, hidden in the depths of the nebula. Renner had set a course for a distant, uncharted region of space, far from the Takara's reach. They couldn't stay on the run forever, but for now they had bought themselves some time. Reed sat beside Kaela's bed in the med bay, watching her sleep. Her breathing was steady, but she was still weak, her body recovering from the strain of using her powers. He didn't know how long she would need to fully heal, if she could heal at all. You're going to be okay, Reed whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. Kaela stirred, her eyes fluttering open. You should leave me behind, she said softly. It's too dangerous. The Takara. They'll never stop. Reed shook his head. I'm not leaving you. We'll figure this out. Together. Kaela looked at him, her eyes filled with something Reed hadn't seen before: hope. Thank you, Captain. Reed smiled faintly, though his mind was still racing. They had escaped the Takara for now, but the fight was far from over. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't stop fighting for Kaela, no matter the cost. The stars stretched out before them, an endless expanse of possibilities and dangers. Somewhere out there the Takara were still searching, but for now the Horizon sailed on, free. And Reed knew that as long as they had each other, they still had a chance.